Almighty infinite Father, faithfully loving your own. Here in our weakness you find us, falling before your throne. Oh, we're falling before your throne. You are the one that we praise. You are the one we adore. You give the healing and grace our hearts always hunger for. Oh, our hearts always hunger for. You are the one that we praise. You are the one we adore. You give the healing and grace our hearts always hunger for. Oh, our hearts always hunger for. Wonderful, merciful Savior, precious Redeemer and friend, who would have thought that a lamb could rescue the souls of men? Oh, you rescue the souls of men. Counselor, Comforter, Keeper, Spirit we long to embrace. You offer hope when our hearts have hopelessly lost our way. Oh, we've hopelessly lost our way. You are the one that we praise. You are the one we adore. You give the healing and grace our hearts always hunger for. Oh, our hearts always hunger for.
Good morning, Legacy Bible Church. Oh, what a beautiful day it is today, and we are so thankful that through all of this with COVID-19 and all of the stay-at-home orders and then them being lifted and then them being reenacted again, that we have been an online teaching ministry from the start. We do have people who come in to our services, but we've got to stop doing that. So what we're going to do is, if you would like to come in person to Legacy Bible Church, we need you to send an email to, it'll be on the website, it'll be on Facebook, it'll be everywhere. But basically it is robin.goodall@lbcdfw.org or steve.goodall@lbcdfw.org. So in an effort to keep everybody safe, we are just making everything online at the moment. And we are so thankful that we're already set up to do that. Now, for my little teaching blurb, I want to ask you a question. How do you, as a believer, die to yourself? That's the question. How do you within your own person die to yourself? I'll give you the answer next week if you don't already know. I'm going to welcome my husband, Steve Goodall, for today's teaching.
You want to check the mic? It's good. Check, check. Well, that's called a teaser. Okay, good. Yeah. That's called a teaser, church. And I look forward to hearing how Robin teaches that next week. She is becoming quite the theologian and biblical teacher in her own right. And she will have a way of explaining the dying to self that may hit home a little more than my teaching has. And so I look forward to hearing what she has to say. So welcome. We love the ministry that God has given us at Legacy Bible Church to provide, to bring back the biblical message of God's salvation plan. And we are so excited to be used by God for that purpose. Now, last week, I'm gonna give a little bit of a historical perspective, and then I want to go back where I left off last week. And you'll remember last week I left it the last portion of what I call Jerusalem 2. It's Paul's second post-conversion trip to Jerusalem. Took place in late AD 46, and just prior to being launched onto his first missionary journey with Barnabas. He went back up to Jerusalem, took an offering, brought Titus with them from Antioch, and made his second visit. His first visit, this is the historical perspective, and this is so important, church, in terms of understanding God's salvation plan. There's really nowhere in the New Testament that describes with such vivid clarity the two traditions that had evolved very early in the church. And so I've, over the last couple of weeks, kind of walked through chapter 1 and now into chapter 2 to sort of bring out this historical perspective that will help the church. It's been lost from the church. The church generally, when I say the church, I'm talking broadly speaking, the visible church in the world, your local congregations. It has been broadly understood and believed that the church tradition that survived those early years and prospered and became a global faith community is broadly believed that that's the apostolic tradition, that other competing traditions were finally eliminated, and that a so-called Catholic, Orthodox, Apostolic Christian tradition survived and evolved into eventually what we now know as Christianity in this modern era, despite the fact that there are multiple traditions still. Roman Catholicism, Eastern Orthodoxy, Protestantism, of which there are, umpteen traditions. The thinking is generally that these all evolved out of the apostolic tradition that survived those early years and the conflicts in those early years of the church. That's not the case. And Paul paints a picture in Galatians that's very raw, very vivid, if you understand what you're reading, and largely it has not been understood because of bad teaching and bad tradition. The tradition that survived has interpreted the New Testament documents through the lens of their surviving tradition. And so that has evolved through 2,000 years now of a tradition of interpreting, translating, teaching out of the New Testament documents through the lens of this tradition that survived that early conflict. And the tradition that survived, people are going to be very surprised to hear, but it's true, was not the apostolic tradition. It's what Paul calls here in Galatians the heteros euangelion. Heteros is an adjective of duality. It means two. It doesn't mean one of many. It's sort of like heterosexual is a term that infers two realms of sexuality, the male and the female, heterosexual. Well, it's the same meaning and context where Paul uses the term heteros euangelion, meaning the other gospel, not another gospel, which is relative and can be one of many, but the other good message. And so Paul talks about that here in Galatians. You can see that in verse 1:6. Unfortunately, your English tradition is probably going to refer to it as another good message, not the other good message. And that's an incorrect translation. Paul makes that very clear in verse 7 when he actually uses the relative adjective allos, which means another. And he says, he refers to the other good message, which is not another. And what he's meaning by that is that it's not, the other good message is not one of many. It's just the other good message. And Paul in Galatians, in AD 48, when he writes it, he's still hopeful, still strongly desiring that the Jewish Christians in Jerusalem, if they could just hear a good teaching out of the Hebrew Scriptures about the good message of Christ, the apostolic tradition, he was hopeful that they would come on board with it, that they would say, okay, we're seeing that. And that was Paul's hope. That was his motivation. That's one of the main reasons he went back up to Jerusalem for Jerusalem 2 in early AD 46. He said, I went on account of the revelation of God. He went up. And he wanted to explain to them the reality of the fullness of God's salvation plan, which Paul refers to as the good message of Christ. And that's not in opposition to, but that's in contrasting with what he called the other good message. And the other good message was the message, basically a Judaized good message, that of Christians, genuine spirit regenerated Christians who received faith to believe from God. They believed in Jesus for the forgiveness of sins, but they would not enter into this realm that Robin's going to talk about next week of dying to self according to the obedience from faith into spiritually spoken worship. They would not do that. It was offensive to them. It was a stumbling block to them. That's why Paul in Galatians refers to it as the stumbling block of the cross. In chapter 5, he would refer to that. And the stumbling block of the cross is simply his terminology for the offense in the world toward this unworldly realm of dying to self according to the obedience from faith, becoming spiritual worshipers of God. the offense of the cross, the stumbling block of the cross, is the worldly reaction to this unworldly realm of communion with God. And the Jews of Jerusalem, the Jewish Christians, were living a very small sect, a very small minority of Jews who had converted into Christianity from faith, through faith. And they were a very small minority in this Jewish culture that still had the temple cultus, the priesthood, animal sacrifices. All of that was still going on around them. And the Jews were zealous for Moses. They would die to protect their Mosaic tradition, the Jews in general. And so the Jewish Christians in Jerusalem were in the midst of this huge complex of Judaism that would violently protect their Mosaic tradition, their Torah tradition, the law, works from the law. They would violently protect anything that might come against that. And for the Jews, the non-Christian Jews, the cross was a stumbling block. And what Paul means by that is that the cross, where Christians have an open invitation to become sharers in the death of the Son. It's Romans 6:5. If we would become united ones in his death, in the death of Jesus Christ, if we would become united ones in the likeness of his death, writes Paul, certainly, surely we shall be of his resurrection, not likeness, but of his resurrection. So we die to self according to the obedience from faith, where we remove our mind from the process. And Paul writes, certainly and surely God, by the working of God, we shall be, it's a stative verb, eimi, to be, we shall be of his resurrection. And that is the spiritual, the functional, spiritual, participative realm of spiritually spoken worship. It's from faith. You have faith to believe. It's out of that faith that this realm exists and is the realm where we, the children of God, are given the privilege, church, the privilege, the honor from God to be his vessels for his salvation plan, to participate with him in his salvation plan. But this is offensive to the world. And so that's why Paul calls it the stumbling block of the cross. The stumbling block of the cross is that when we would participate in God's salvation plan, becoming united ones in the likeness of his death, we begin speaking in unknowable utterances that can't connect with, they cannot be understood, comprehended by the human mind. That's God's designed it that way. Why? Because our human minds are sin infected. And the holiness and perfection and righteousness of God is not going to come and operate through the sin-infected human mind. That has to be removed from the process and allow then, by the working of God, surely we shall be of his resurrection, by the working of God, through the Spirit, then the mind of Christ becomes the power controlling the organs of speech that bring forth these utterances from heaven into the earth that are from Jesus Christ himself, translated from heaven to earth by the working of the Holy Spirit through the flesh of the children of God who will become subjected into this realm. That's God's salvation plan. This is what Paul writes about. This is what Jesus taught about in the gospel. This is what all of the New Testament authors are writing about. But if a tradition has survived in the church from the earliest years and is interpreting these New Testament documents through a lens that is offended by the cross and will not participate in the cross, then the church for 2,000 years, and this is the truth, this is the reality, the church for 2,000 years has been walking in a non-apostolic tradition. Non-Pauline, non-Johannine, non-Petrine tradition, because this is what they wrote about. This is what Paul and John and Peter and Jude, this is what they wrote about. The author of Hebrews, this is what they wrote about. This is the apostolic tradition. But all of their writings have been reinterpreted through the lens of the heteros euangelion. First at Jerusalem, with the church at Jerusalem, which is what Paul was engaging with, and ultimately through the church at Rome. After AD 70, when Jerusalem was destroyed, and over a period of about a generation, leadership in the church would transition from Jewish leadership into Gentile leadership. And because of the power centers of Jerusalem and Rome and the connection between Jerusalem and Rome, this other tradition during the pre-AD 70 generation took hold very deeply, was seated and took hold in the church at Rome. It's one of the reasons, one of the evidences of that is one of the early church fathers at Rome, Clement of Rome. Some of the earliest writings in the church come from the 1st century from the bishop of the church at Rome, whose name was Clement. And he was bishop after AD 70, after the AD 70 destruction of Jerusalem, when that leadership transition was taking place. Clement was a Gentile, he was not a Jew, and he wrote some of the earliest letters that we have, Clement of Rome. You can read it, it's very accessible, it's been translated. Here's one of the realities of Clement of Rome. He's a generation after, more than a generation after the cross. All the New Testament documents have been written. Clement has access to the Gospels, and he has access to the New Testament epistles. It was not a New Testament canon at that time. They were just individual documents circulating in the church. But Clement of Rome does not cite and quote any of the apostolic writings. He only quotes from the Old Testament. Clement is unique among the apostolic fathers. The apostolic fathers are the church leaders that wrote, that came after the passing of the apostles. So Clement was one of the first among the apostolic fathers that wrote. You have others like Ignatius, Polycarp, Irenaeus, a number of apostolic fathers that wrote after the passing of the apostles. Clement was one of the first. I want you to see and hear this connection between Jerusalem and Rome. The other tradition of Jerusalem taking hold in Rome is evidenced by the fact that Clement, in the latter part of the 1st century, wrote a very long document about conflict in Corinth. Very long document, one of the longest apostolic documents of the apostolic fathers, and he's unique. He does not quote from the writings of the apostles. Here's Clement writing, First Clement, maybe as early as the 70s. It's debated, was it in the 70s, the 80s? But that's not really what matters here. What matters is whether he wrote it in the 70s or 80s, Clement has access to all of the apostolic documents, but he doesn't use them. He doesn't quote from them. It's almost like they are just dismissed. They are not part of the core of the ministry happening in the church at Rome. Why? The reason is because the other euangelion that evolved at Jerusalem, out of the strong ties between Jerusalem and the Jewish community of 50,000 or so Jews in Rome, the power center of the Roman Empire, the other good message seated at Rome and became the foundation, became the tradition at Rome. That's one of the reasons why Paul would write Romans, and at the end in chapter 15, I think it's in verse 25 or thereabouts, Paul says that he wants to pass through Rome on his way to Spain because it's not his job, his mission, to build upon another kind of foundation. You hear that? Paul tells the Romans in his letter, I'm going to pass through and see you, be refreshed by you and with you on my way to Spain, because it's not my role in ministry to change your tradition, Paul's writing. Now this is in AD 57 that Paul writes this to the church at Rome. I'm going to pass through because I don't build upon another kind of foundation. Now your translation, if you look at it, will say possibly another man's foundation. That's not really how Paul wrote. He used the adjective alatrios, another kind of, and foundation, another kind of foundation, another tradition. So as early as writing in AD 57, Paul writing Romans, he's acknowledging that in Rome there's a church established on another foundation than the good message of Christ that he teaches, that he builds churches upon. So he'll pass through on his way to Spain, because Rome is another kind of foundation, another kind of gospel. The other, Paul wrote 10 years earlier in the letter of Galatians, the other good message. Now here's something that's very important for you to know. You and most of you raised in the other good message tradition that evolved out of the first century through this process that Paul reveals to us took place in Jerusalem and evolved in Rome, that this good message, and Galatians is really the only place we see this, church. Paul essentially gives his nod of approval, if you will. I call it in my commentary a backhanded approval. It's not really out there overt. He's not happy about it, but he's acknowledging that there's a quasi legitimacy to the other good message. Why? Because it's based on faith. It is based on the near purpose of God's salvation plan. It is the realm of Christians, Jewish Christians in those early years, who have indeed received faith to believe from God. They are spirit regenerated children of God. Paul just says they're disobedient from their faith. They won't be obedient from faith into God's end purpose. Rather, they want to cling to their Mosaic tradition, accommodationist to the Jewish culture there. Really, they were afraid of being persecuted out of existence. Paul makes that very clear in Galatians, that it was out of fear of persecution that this watered down good message that Paul calls the other good message took hold. Persecution that evolved first out of the martyrdom of Stephen in AD 34, and then again in the martyrdom of the Apostle James in AD 43, 9 years later. These events of church leaders being killed in Jerusalem had a very damping effect on the gospel. So this is the background for Galatians. This is the background for for understanding Jerusalem 1. Paul's first journey to Jerusalem took place in AD 36. You see that at the end of chapter 1, where Paul says that there was no one apart. This is verse, I believe, 19, 119. There's no one apart from the apostles except James, the brother of the Lord. And that has often been translated to read essentially that Paul went up and he only visited with Peter and James, because just before that he said, I stayed with Peter for 15 days. There was no one apart from the apostles except for the brother of the Lord. Been translated and understood that, well, Paul went up there and he only met with Peter and James. No, that's not what that means. What that means in its literal sense is that as of Jerusalem 1, this is what Paul wants his readers to know. As he's writing Galatians in AD 48, 12 years later, he's reflecting back and saying, when I went up there the first time in AD 36, I met with the apostles and I met with James and others. I was even teaching in the Greek synagogues that I used to be a part of, and they would ultimately plot to kill me, and I would be ushered out by Barnabas off to Tarsus for my lost years from 37 to 45. But what Paul wants you to know about Jerusalem 1, his primary purpose for telling us about his trip to Jerusalem is to say this. At that time, in AD 36, 2 years after the martyr of Stephen, when the Hellenistic deacons were scattered out. They all left and went to various places, Cyprus, Antioch, Phoenicia. But the apostles stayed in Jerusalem. They didn't scatter. So AD 36, Paul goes back after his 3 years in Arabia, and here's what he wants us to know. He wants us to know the apostles are still unified in the fullness of the good message. But what he's saying there in verse 19 is there was only one exception in the ostensible leadership and influential ones in the church. That was James, the brother of the Lord. He was a lone exception to the unified apostles who were holding to the fullness of the good message of Christ. James, Paul's purpose here in this first trip to Jerusalem in AD 36 is to say already in AD 36, just 2 years after the martyrdom of Stephen, James, the brother of the Lord, is beginning to percolate this other tradition that's accommodationist to the Jews out of fear of persecution. This accommodationist mode that is walking in the faith that they've received, but not in the obedience from faith, the end purpose of God. They're avoiding that because it's offensive to the Jews. And so the process has begun there in those early years to reinterpret the Hebrew scriptures for the benefit of this other tradition, this other good message that is now evolving, so that the Hebrew scriptures can be viewed through the lens of this sect of Jewish Christians in Jerusalem, fearing persecution from their brother Jews, fearing their persecution, beginning then to accommodate them and to make Christianity not so offensive to them, so that they won't be persecuted. This is what Paul is writing in Galatians. And this is the message he wants you to have about his first trip in AD 36. James was already percolating the other good message even as early as that. But the apostles in AD 36 were a unified block still into the fullness of the good message. That's Jerusalem 1, AD 36. Fast forward now 9 years to late AD 46. Paul makes another trip to Jerusalem. He says, out of the revelation of God, he went up, meaning Paul is now going up to have a discussion with him about his understanding, revealed to him by God through these now 14 years that he's been a Christian, walking in the good message of Christ, the obedience from faith. He's going up now in this second trip in AD 46, late AD 46, and he wants to present to the leadership of the church his understanding of the fullness of God's salvation plan. Now, James the apostle has already been martyred about 3 years earlier, and that shook up the apostles that stayed after Stephen's martyrdom, so that they left. Peter's now traveling, John is now traveling, and so we can presume that the apostles out of that martyrdom basically abandoned ship at Jerusalem. That left James, the brother of the Lord, as the leader, the top dog, the man at Jerusalem. With the martyrdom of James in AD 43. You'll recall Acts chapter 12, where Peter was imprisoned by Herod Agrippa the first. Peter was next in line. Peter was about to experience the same fate that the apostle James experienced, except for a messenger of the Lord, an angel of the Lord, showed up in the middle of the night, and the escape of Peter from prison occurred. And I believe that the implication there is that Peter slinked out of Jerusalem under the cover of night, and began there in AD 43, the exodus from Jerusalem of the 12, the apostles. But in any case, we can know James 3-4 years later as of Jerusalem 2, which Paul writes about in chapter 2 of Galatians, which I'm reading out of now. At Jerusalem 2, the second trip to Jerusalem, where he's going up now after 14 years, he has his own knowledge, revelation, teaching about the good message of Christ, the salvation plan of God. Paul's going up to present this to those of influence. He won't even call them the apostles, those of influence in Jerusalem. And recognizing that James is the leader, because when he refers to James and Cephas and John later in the same passage at the end, he puts James first. Remember from past weeks discussing the order of names given in this kind of succession is very important. An author is always, just like Luke did with respect to the church at Antioch in Acts 13:1, where he placed Barnabas first and Paul last and 3 others in between. That's a pecking order. At that time, Paul was the low man on the totem pole. He hadn't started his missionary journeys yet. He was the Jew that used to persecute the church, and now he was a leader in the church, but he was the bottom of the pecking order. And so the same thing is happening here in Paul's writing in chapter 2 of Galatians, when he refers to James and Cephas and John, placing James first. Paul is acknowledging James is the top dog at Jerusalem. He's the man. He is the main head leader of the church at Jerusalem. He is, if you want to call it that, draw a term from the Gentile churches, he was the bishop at Jerusalem. And so that's one of the reasons why in later in chapter 2, when Paul is writing about the Antioch incident, he writes certain men from James, those from the circumcision, came from Jerusalem as a counter mission against the teaching of Paul. Certain men from James, just a few verses later in chapter 2, verse 12. Church, this is important for you to know. It's important for you to have this picture and to understand what happened in these early years, what Paul is telling us, teaching us in Galatians, to understand and grasp, because it's hard. You know, when I tell you that the tradition that's existed in the church for most of her history is not even the apostolic tradition that is written about in the New Testament, most of you, and certainly your church leaders, are going to just shake their head and say, that's crazy. How can that be? And it's only through understanding what's really being written about in the New Testament documents, in the apostolic sources, what they call in the scholastic theological realm, the primary sources. There are no written sources or evidences that are superior than the New Testament documents. And so the New Testament documents is where we will see the reality of the apostolic tradition that was persecuted out of existence. And in Paul's very first letter here in AD 48, as this brand new counter mission is coming out of Jerusalem against his teaching in the Gentile world, leaving the world of Judea and Judaism, coming into the Gentile world where Paul has been agreed to in Jerusalem too, that he's the apostle to the Gentiles. Just 2 years later, this Antioch incident in AD 48, certain men from James, a counter mission against his teaching comes from Jerusalem, comes from James, 2 years after Jerusalem too. And, you can just almost hear Paul saying, what the heck? We had an agreement 2 years ago in Jerusalem. I'm the apostle to the Gentiles, and you all are the apostles to the circumcision. We agreed to that. What is this counter mission now coming to Antioch from Judea? This is the emotion that Paul's writing out of in AD 48 when he writes Galatians. This is why Paul starts by reflecting on Jerusalem 1 in AD 46. The apostles were still together, but you had James percolating already. Paul says, I noticed that when I was there in AD 36. And then he's reflecting in chapter 2 on Jerusalem 2 in AD 46, 10 years later. And he's saying, now the apostles are scattered and there's another group of leadership under James, and this other good message is firmly taken hold. That's how he starts chapter 2, Jerusalem 2. Is what was just percolating in AD 36 has now taken hold at Jerusalem in AD 46. And important to see the connection that this has taken hold 10 years later in AD 57 when Paul writes Romans. This tradition, this another type of foundation, he writes then, has taken hold in Rome. I'm just going to pass through Rome. I'm not going to build on another kind of foundation. I'm going to go where no foundation has been set yet in Spain and establish the foundation according to the good message of Christ that I hold to. This is what's transpiring in those early decades of the church. Competing traditions. Here in Galatians, Paul gives credence. He gives, again, what I'm calling quasi-legitimacy to this other good message because he believed, and I think rightfully so, and this is important for the survival of the other good message in the modern church. Paul believed that they are genuine spirit-regenerated children of God. God has given them faith to believe. They're just not willing to walk in the fullness of God's salvation plan. So he calls it the other good message. He's not being pejorative there. He's not tearing them down. He's saying, if I can say it in so many words, he's saying, okay, I'll give you that this is some form of the good message of God's salvation plan, because indeed God has given faith and you do believe in Jesus for the forgiveness of sins. So there's a quasi-legitimacy there. So we'll call it the heteros euangelion, one of two. There's the good message of Christ, and there's this other good message that has percolated and brewed for 10 years and now has taken hold at Jerusalem under the leadership of James. He writes in Galatians chapter 2 about Jerusalem 2, and then in the latter part of chapter 2, AD 48, just 2 years later, now this other good message tradition in Jerusalem is sending out their own mission to teach their good message These are the things you have to know to understand what Paul's writing about here. This counter mission from Jerusalem being sent by the other good message, the heteros euangelion, the Judaized good message. They have faith to believe, but they will not suffer the offense of the cross. Why? Because it made the Jews angry to the point of killing off their leadership. They proved it with Stephen and the apostle James. And they, out of fear of persecution, have this other good message. Now, in AD 48, the second half of chapter 2 of Galatians, now this other good message is sending out their own counter mission, their own teaching about the other good message that Paul calls here in the writing on Jerusalem 2, he calls an apostleship. Why? What's an apostleship? It's a different term than apostles. An apostleship is a function, it's an assignment, if you will. They're sent ones. All apostle means is sent one, by the way, church, if you didn't know that. Apostle means a sent one. Apostello, the verb, means to send. And apostleship is an assignment of being sent out. And so this other good message in Jerusalem in AD 48, after Paul has done his first missionary journey in Galatia, and the Jews have gone up in arms, and word of that's gotten back to Jerusalem, and they're worried about persecution. Here comes the letter of James, from certain men from James, those from the circumcision up to Antioch, teaching, we know from Acts 15:1, teaching, unless you're circumcised, teaching the Gentile Christians, unless you're circumcised, you cannot be saved. That's the counter mission coming. That's what Paul calls, here in chapter 2, we're going to read it, that's what Paul calls. I want you to understand these things when you hear it read in the text. That's what Paul calls an apostleship, from Petros, from Peter. And we're going to talk about what he means by that term Peter. He's not referring to Peter the apostle. Why? Because Paul only knows him as Cephas, by his Aramaic name. But here in chapter 2, he uses Petros 2 times in reference to this sending out of this apostleship, this ministry being sent out from Jerusalem now to teach the other good message. Certain men from James, those from the circumcision, are sent out from Jerusalem as a counter mission against Paul's mission to the Gentiles. They're going to go to those same places and they're going to teach you their good message. And they're going to say, this man, Paul, is teaching you wrongly. Don't listen to him. There will be no salvation for you in the Apostle Paul's teaching about this matter of becoming united ones in the likeness of his death. Don't listen to him. We are from Jerusalem. We are from James and the legitimate leadership of the church. We have the correct message for you. We have the message of life and the message of salvation that is still and remains through the Mosaic law, through works of the law, through obedience to Torah. You Gentile Christians who who want to be grafted into our Jewish covenant with God have to become loyal to Moses if you want to be saved. They taught, that's the truth, that's the reality. How did that survive in the modern church then? This other good message that Paul is acknowledging has taken hold in Rome in AD 47 when Jews were still in leadership. This other good message has taken hold there, this other foundation. It's not Paul's teaching on the good message of Christ. It's the Judaized tradition out of their own revelation, Paul writes in Galatians 2:2, has taken hold in Rome and would become the tradition after the destruction of Jerusalem when Gentiles take leadership at Rome, evidenced by Clement, who would not quote, wrote a very long letter. It's over 30, mid-30s, about 35, 36 chapters. It's a long letter. He never quotes from the apostles. He never quotes from the Gospels. Clement only quotes from the Old Testament. He's a Gentile leader in the post-AD 70 church at Rome, and he will not quote from the apostolic documents. He will only quote in the context of the Judaized other good message. He will only quote from the Hebrew Scriptures, which there's nothing wrong with that per se, but it's evidence that they are still arm's length from the writings of the apostolic tradition. Why? Because the apostolic tradition of obedience was still active in the church. And they at Rome were offended by it. They didn't hold to that. They didn't like it. And so these traditions that still hold to the apostolic tradition, the good message of Christ, primarily in Syria and near Asia, Ephesus, Smyrna, Colossae, that region, the churches of South Galatia, the church at Antioch. These churches in the days of Clement, in the last half of the first century after Peter had been martyred in the 70s and 80s, these churches of Syria and near Asia still held to the full gospel. But in Rome, they didn't. The churches in near Asia and Syria were quoting from liberally from the apostolic documents. We can know that from Ignatius. Ignatius was the bishop of the church at Antioch, and he was taken from Antioch by force to Rome, and he was martyred in about 110 AD, roughly in that time frame. And while Ignatius was making the trip from Antioch to Rome, they were passing through near Asia, he was writing letters. And we still have those letters. And Ignatius was quoting liberally from the apostolic documents. It's all over the writings of Ignatius. But not Clement of Rome. Clement of Rome would not quote from these apostolic documents that were undergirding this good message of Christ that was still being practiced in most of the churches of Syria and near Asia. In Rome, they want nothing to do with that. And to quote from those same apostolic documents would be tantamount to when Jesus asked the Jewish leaders at the temple, and they said, "Who gave you your authority?" And Jesus said, "Let me ask you a question. Is the authority of John the Baptist from heaven or from men?" For Clement to use the apostolic documents in the latter half of the first century, when there's still the good message of Christ tradition happening in most of the churches of Syria and Asia, would be to acknowledge their tradition as legitimate and true, which the question would then be asked, well, then why don't you do it? Of Clement of Rome. If you're going to quote from the apostolic documents, then why don't you do their tradition? So that's why Clement of Rome, in the 70s, 80s AD, after the passing of the martyrdom of the apostles, he wouldn't quote from their letters. So we can know that the other tradition, based on Paul's writing in Romans, about this other kind of foundation at Rome, based on the evidence of Clement's writing 20, 30 years after that, we can know that the tradition at Rome was a descendant of this other tradition from Jerusalem. Become a I call it a quasi-Jewish tradition at Rome that ended up spreading throughout the Roman Empire over a course of 100 years or more of violent persecution that finally stamped out the apostolic tradition. And what survived is this, what Paul calls in Galatians in AD 48, the other good message, where they, very educated, very smart, very intelligent Jews in the Hebrew Scriptures interpreted the Hebrew Scriptures through the lens of this other good message, and that became the tradition that survived into the church. So you ask, well, how did the apostles, the documents, the New Testament documents, become then infused back into this other good message? And the answer there is we owe that largely to Irenaeus, who wrote in the last part of the 2nd century from Lyons, southern France, Gaul, it was known as Gaul at that time, Lyons, France, where Irenaeus was part of a community that relocated from near Asia down into southern, what is today southern France, and established a community, a believing community in southern France that walked in the good message of Christ. They were ended up violently persecuted, emanating out of Rome, and became an accommodationist community into the other good message, of which Irenaeus was made the leader. So Irenaeus grew up. He studied under Polycarp in Smyrna. Polycarp is one of the primary post-apostolic fathers, the last one to die that had direct connection to one of the apostles. Polycarp studied at the feet of John the Elder, who was the bishop at Ephesus. Well, Irenaeus came out of that world, relocated to southern France with a community that was walking in the fullness. They were violently persecuted. Irenaeus went to Rome to beseech the bishop at Rome on behalf of the community at Lyons. Happened to be concurrent with this violent persecution that took place. He went back. The leadership had been wiped out. And Irenaeus, freshly coming back from Rome, became the leader of the church at Lyons. That's the history of the church. This is in about 180 AD. And here's the key thing here. This is the point that I want you to get here. Irenaeus is largely to be credited for giving credibility to the apostolic documents, particularly the writings of Paul, which were largely taboo in the church at Rome because they were the support and the undergirding of this other tradition that but the good message of Christ that they persecuted. And they weren't going to use it. Well, Irenaeus took those apostolic documents to argue against the heresy of Gnosticism. And he was fabulously successful at arguing against this heresy that had evolved in the church. And here's what Irenaeus did. He used the apostolic documents, and particularly Paul's letters, to put down this heresy of Gnosticism. And so seeing how Irenaeus used the Pauline letters to put down this genuine heresy called Gnosticism, the church became ingratiated to Paul's writings late in the 2nd century. They said, well, his writings aren't so bad. We can use Paul's letters through the lens of what Irenaeus has done. Irenaeus knew both traditions, the other good message of Christ, the Pauline, Johannine tradition, and this other good message that had taken seat at Rome. Irenaeus knew both worlds. And so to argue against Gnosticism, he needed Paul's letters. And he was fabulously successful. I highly recommend that you read Irenaeus. I'm still in the process of it. I-R-E-A-E I-R-E-N-A-E-U-S, Irenaeus. Irenaeus is the one that saved Paul's letters for the church. Otherwise, Paul's letters would have been lost to obscurity, like much literature in that time frame. But because Irenaeus was credited, and rightfully so, with putting down this vicious Gnostic heresy, using Paul's letters, using them in a way that was not offensive to the other good message at Rome, Paul came back into favor through this new lens. So a lot of the interpretation of Paul that we have today that has survived in the modern church, you can credit Irenaeus for. And you'll see it if you read Irenaeus. It's a fascinating story. But here's what I'm going to leave you with, and this is the message, and we will wrap it up next week. I think this sets the foundation that we can now talk about Jerusalem 2, what Paul means when he uses the term Petros, not Cephas, Petros. And what he means when he refers to an apostleship here early in chapter 2, along with Petros. Petros being what generated this counter mission that Paul calls an apostleship in chapter 2. When he refers to an apostleship here in verses 8, 9, 10, while he's writing about Jerusalem 10, when he refers to an apostleship, he's referring to the sent ones. Remember, apostleship just means a ministry that goes out. Paul's ministry was an apostleship. His was from the Lord. This apostleship from Petros is from men. Certain men from James, those from the circumcision. An apostleship. Sent ones coming out of Jerusalem as a counter mission against Paul's teaching, against the good message of Christ. This is what Paul is saying in chapter 2 when he refers to Petros as the rock, meaning the revelation, faith to believe, but not walking in the obedience from faith, sending an apostleship out, a counter mission, certain men from James. We'll walk through that next week. This history of the church is so vital to understand so that you can hear and read Galatians through that lens and have a better understanding of just what Paul's writing. What is he writing about? This is what he's writing about, church. This is what he is setting up in chapter 1 and chapter 2 of his first letter, Galatians. It's a historical backward view of the first 14 years of his converted life. Fascinating story, sets up this dichotomy of two traditions in the church, which would survive, one of which would become the Catholic, Orthodox, Universal Christian Church, of which most traditions today are descendants out of, and not out of the true apostolic tradition of the good message of Christ. Fascinating story. Will really open up your eyes as to God's end purpose, which is what we teach here at Legacy Bible Church. Our encouragement, our exhortation is, if God has given you faith to believe, you are a child of God, eternally secure. And irregardless and in spite of all the things you've been taught at church, at your local church, that evolved out of the heteros euangelion, all of those pseudo-mosaic things that they say, do this, do this, do this, do this, and then you might hope to have the favor of God and the pleasure of God. You can disregard all of that and know that you know that you know in your heart that God, your Father, only wants one thing from you. God, your Father, only wants worship in spirit and in truth, spiritually spoken worship. Praise that is from God and not from men. The words of our Lord Jesus Christ that reconcile with the will of the Father and by the working of the Spirit are releasing the righteousness of God, God's salvation plan, the rhema of Christ, the unknowable utterances of spiritually spoken prayers being released into the world. That is what we have the joy and the privilege of teaching here at Legacy Bible Church, and we are excited about the ministry God has given us. We'll look forward to seeing you next Sunday at 10:30. And in the meantime, I'll finish by saying, as Robin did, we are a fellowship. We're not just a teaching ministry. We gather together, we pray together, we worship God together, and we share in teachings about the salvation plan of God, teaching straight out of the Bible and only out of the Bible and in full accordance with the meaning of the New Testament authors. That's what we do. And if you would like to join us in person, we do have limited capacity, but you can, as Robin said, you can reach out to us via email and say, hey, I'd like to come and sit in with your fellowship and talk to you in person about God's salvation plan. And we would love the opportunity to do that. And you can start by sending us an email, and we'll be in contact, and we'll make that happen. And we'll look forward to that. God bless you, church, and we will see you next week.
Wonderful, merciful Savior, precious Redeemer and friend, the Lamb could rescue the souls of men. Oh, you rescue the souls of men. Counselor, Comforter, Keeper, Spirit